I am preparing to play Jo March this spring in a production of Little Women. So this means I am in the process of rereading the novel, which is longer than I remember. The adaptation that I'm in is only about 90 minutes, maybe even a little less. It moves pretty quickly. So here are some things I am paying special attention to in my reread. What Jo says about herself, what other people say about Jo and how she is described, her relationships, the specificities of reactions, and the language she uses for each person she speaks to. Do her tactics change depending on who she's speaking to? For example, how does she speak to Laurie versus Amy versus Beth? Those are three very different relationships, and I can learn a lot about them based on her speaking patterns and the way that she reacts to what they say. How does Jo act privately versus around others? How does Jo change throughout the novel? As she grows up, how does her language change, her opinions, her attitude towards life? What are the inflection points in her life and major moments of character development? These will also, of course, be in the script. I will also kind of be reading alongside the script to note what's absent and what was kept and why, all of that jazz. I'm reading the novel as kind of an undercurrent, as like background noise, because the play is its own thing, and my interpretation of Jo needs to stand alone within the play. She should make sense to someone who has never read the novel. However, I can fill in the gaps and gain a richer understanding of the in-between moments of Jo's life through the book. I do believe that the play is king. I'm gonna believe the play over the book, if that makes any sense, and I believe our interpretation of the play over everything. I need to be in the world that we create in the rehearsal room first and foremost, even if it contradicts something in the novel. My responsibility is to the thing we create in the room. However, my job is also to bring richness and embodiment into the rehearsal room, which all of these things that I mentioned that I'll be watching for in the book can help me attain. The play is very faithful to the book though, so I don't think there will be too much friction there. The main friction will be how all of this dramaturgy lives in my body with the other actors in the room. Playing a well-known and beloved character is always a negotiation between the script, the collective consciousness, and my own truth. Other research I'm currently doing is delving into Louisa May Alcott's life, and especially her other work. She wrote many other novels, novellas, poems, and short stories, and she was known for more provocative work than Little Women. Her other work might give me some insight into Jo's writing as well, since Jo is Louisa's proxy. I have a hunch that building Jo March's specific imagination and how that manifests in her writing will do a lot to capture her overall spirit. I've also been reading a lot of interesting perspectives on Louisa's gender, and how if she were alive today, she might not identify with she/her pronouns or being a cis woman. She, like the heroine of her novel, often bemoaned being a woman and said she was, quote, more than half persuaded that I am, by some freak of nature, a man's soul put into a woman's body, unquote, which is reflected both in Little Women, as the novel, and in the play adaptation, where Jo and Laurie have this exchange. Jo says, I wish I was a horse so I could run for miles in this splendid air. And Laurie says, well, run for miles then, because I assumed you were a horse. What do you think you are, a girl? Jo says, yes, even though I wish I wasn't. Laurie says, a horse or a girl? Jo says, a girl, Laurie. Laurie says, well, what would you rather be? Jo says, a man. And then she goes on to say like why she would rather be a man, and it's more about the limits imposed upon her than like the gender itself, but still certainly something to think about. It definitely warrants thoughtful consideration, both about what it means for the character and what it means about my specific interpretation. How Jo's gender is played might also color the relationship between her and Laurie and what's going on there. Which, that relationship is another big puzzle piece that I've kind of been curious about, because in my research, I have found that Louisa mainly decided against Jo and Laurie getting together to frustrate her readership, which signals to me that Jo's decision to reject Laurie comes less from like pure character and more from a mix of character and sheer authorial will. The author made that choice, not necessarily the character, which I feel like gives me a little breathing room, you know? Louisa wrote a relationship that was complicated enough to lead the audience to believe that Jo loved Laurie romantically, a complexity I can live in, ambiguity that feels full of possibility as an actor. How Jo loves Laurie isn't something I'm going to decide before I get into the room and meet the actor playing Laurie. I only know the conclusion of their relationship, but the messy in-between, the blurred lines, that's something that we'll get to discover in the room. But I digress. Back to Louisa and therefore Jo's gender. I'm a cis woman, and ultimately my version of Jo March will also likely be a cis woman. However, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't delve into the dysmorphia, queerness, and confusion that Jo clearly goes through. Things that I've experienced in my life, things that many of us, if not all of us, experience in different colors and degrees. Delving into these feelings without judgment, without an end goal of coming out on the other side of it with like solidified answers as to sexuality or gender, feels a lot more honest to me than making hard and fast choices about who Jo March is in a checkbox type of way, because I don't think she knows. The play is about Jo March's artistic becoming. The only answer she fundamentally comes up with in the play is about what stories are worth telling. The thesis of the play is about her artistry, and that is my North Star in this interpretation. Her gender and sexuality are interesting, but the play doesn't answer those aspects about her character in clearly defined lines, so I don't really feel the need to either. My job as an actor is to get specific about the journey, not some like unreached destination. An actor with a different identity than me will have a different perspective on that aspect of Jo, not only because of differences in lived experience, but also because of bodily dramaturgy and how we present on stage to an audience. This is where I also want to point out that what actors do is adaptation, which I have a whole video on that you can check out. In that video, I talk about 3 things that I find essential in successful adaptations: a clear point of view, making full use of the intended form, and respect for the source material. Additionally, I am responsible for creating a Jo March that is in harmony with the play that the team builds in the rehearsal room, and some of the curiosities I'm swirling around right now won't and can't be decided by me alone. It's gonna be decided by the alchemy of the room, the vision of the director, and the choices that my co-actors make about their characters. Some other prep that I have been getting into is some research about the time period and location, which is always fun. I might also rewatch some of the film versions, but likely not until further on in the process when my own interpretation is a lot more solid, as I don't want to be too influenced by other actors' choices early on. I want to find mine first and trust my instincts. So that's what my prep for the role has and is looking like, besides memorization. And then, of course, rehearsals and shows are gonna bring their own clarity and developments. Let me know your fun Little Women facts and thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.